Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. I am your host, Jason Miles. And if you are new to the show, please hit the like, please hit the subscribe button, and please don't forget to hit that bell as we are constantly adding new programming to the channel all the time. Like this just past Monday, we had another episode of our new show, Beyond the Red Zone, our leftist sports show. And just yesterday, we had another episode of Djene Bajalan and Derek Varn's Gaming Materialists, gaming from a leftist perspective. Well, happy St. Patrick's Day to all those that care enough to celebrate it, whatever that means. Welcome to the show, the TIR News Roundup, where we take a slightly deeper dive into the current topics of the current moment. We'll open today with the man of the Mau Mau Hour, Pascal Robert, and his look into Ralph Lauren and his romanticizing of the Jim Crow era. And then we'll check in with everyone's favorite PMC acolyte and the deaths of on the Death Star, an enemy of Twitter bot persona, Amy Therese, Deep State Kuba, where we're going to discuss what's happening in Libya with South American mercenaries. Lastly, I'll have some final thoughts on the current Fed rate hike, looming stagflation, and the loss of middle-class security and how it's affecting us. For the patrons, we're going to have our main man in Peru, Camilo Gomez, giving us our bi-weekly rundown on all things Latin America. So let me bring in the crew. He is the man of the Mau Mau Hour. He is the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles. For those who do not know, this morning I was on the wonderful Ben Dixon's show discussing Eric Adams. If you go back to his morning show, you can search through it to find the portion that I came on in. I was in the first hour. And also, they will be posting a link to my immediate segment tomorrow.
Well, that is amazing. Or great news. I don't know what to say. And let's bring in the PMC of the Death Star. He's got a whole new setup. Deep State Kuba.
Hello, everyone. Let it be known that complaining works. I now have a microphone, so thank you, commenters. You got what you wanted. I hope you're happy. Spent like an hour figuring it out, and I couldn't get the audio to work. But now we're making do. But hopefully it'll reduce the level of those anonymous suggestion box passive aggressive bitch fests about how my voice sounds too crackly or fried.
Crackery?
Crackery, yes, exactly. Crackery. Le mot juste.
For today's day, did you notice I have a new microphone cover?
Oh, yes. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone. Let me see if I can get this right. Top of the morning to you.
At 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Well, I imagine that if you're Irish, you're just like waking up from a hangover at this point.
Ooh.
I will say this, though. Having lived in Boston through large parts of the 90s, I do find Irish crime dramas and mafia films particularly interesting, somewhat more interesting than the Italian derivative.
So what's that guy's name that ratted on everybody and they made a movie about
Whitey
it?
Bulger.
You're talking about Whitey Bulger.
Yeah. Insane. Andy William made probably one of the best comments.
Wait, is Pascal allowed to call him that? I thought that was like kind of their word. Okay. Insist.
I want to ask a question. Does anyone in the audience remember a great TV show that was based in Providence? It lasted maybe 2 seasons. I believe it was called either The Brotherhood or The Brothers. It was about the Irish mob in Providence, Rhode Island. That was a great show. I think it was called The Brotherhood or The Brothers. It had like 2 seasons. It was very good. And yes, The Departed is one of my favorite movies.
Um, yeah, I was going to make another comment, but you kind of threw me off for your love for Irish crime drama.
I really have an affection for it. The Brotherhood. Thank you, Brotherhood.
It's the accents that throw me off.
It's a different aesthetic than the Italian version.
Very, very.
Yeah.
I did like. Did Kuba? Have you seen the movie The Departed is based on the real?
Of course, Infernal Affairs.
Yeah.
Yes. The deepest hell is continuous hell.
I enjoy.
I mean, it starts with the text describing the different infernal punishments to visit evildoers in the Buddhist afterlife.
You know, I'll tell you, someone said the Iberian Liquor Mart in Austin. Big Donna, you're going to the bar? We gotta drive to Fenway.
I think you're doing reverse racism.
No, Boston is an interesting town, man.
Yeah, your reparations claim goes down every time you use that accent.
Every time. You can't get reparations, dude. Every time you do that, Candace Owens gets stronger.
Oh, listen. I went to Irish Catholic high school with a lot of Italian students. I lived in Boston for several years. I know the Irish marginally well. Interesting
You sound
people.
like a white guy that just used the N-word on a talk show. I went to a school with these people. I fucked one. I know them very well.
Wait, that's Quentin Tarantino's alibi whenever he's asked why his movies have
the... You just use Tarantino's alibi to drop the N-word more than us.
Like Tarantino got like abandoned in a series of blaxploitation films in the 70s and was traumatized, and he came out wearing like a silk suit and a top hat, and he just like a sky, and he just couldn't get over it, man.
Dude, Tarantino and the N-word is very uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's an interesting, it's a subject for a whole mile, quite honestly.
But speaking of N-words, you are taking issue with Ralph Lauren and his use of N-words in his new fashion line. What do you have against preppy fashion? I would assume a fraternity guy like yourself would be all about the Jim Crow chic that Lauren is trotting out. Wouldn't you say it's a better look than Kanye's 12 Years a Slave line he tried to drop on us a few years back?
I mean, why do we have to do the false equivalence in that false dichotomy? It's like, what do you like? If you have to go to the bathroom, would you rather hard turds or diarrhea? I mean, I don't understand why we have to resort to those choices. But the point I'm trying to say, for those of you who do not know what my subject is today, Ralph Lauren, the fashion designer, I believe most known for polo brands and things of that nature, kind of the ticket back to the glory days of WASP Anglo-American fashion sense, has started a new line of clothing in a consortium with a young man who works for his company, who's a graduate of Morehouse College, who I recently found out is a member of my fraternity. And what I found particularly noxious about this revanchist, reactionary aesthetic is that all of these people in these images, they all look like they're about to go and wait to get on the back of the Jim Crow bus line in their respective cities, and it typifies to me a very significant problem that I discussed in the last Mile Hour we had, which is a common trope that is very prevalent, particularly amongst college-educated professional black folk, which Adolph Reed discusses in his book Class Notes, and the phenomenon is called romancing Jim Crow. What do we mean by romancing Jim Crow? We mean that basically those who make the argument that integration is what destroyed black folk, and we had our own. We had ice cream stores, and Uncle Jimmy had a hotel, and we had our own bus lines, while 60% of black folk were picking cotton and working as maids and chauffeurs. It was a wonderful time. And what really is interesting to me is that what I've recognized is that very few people outside of black spaces understand how prevalent that thinking is and how common it is. And what I found particularly offensive about this aesthetic at Ralph Lauren is not that it's, to me, it's kind of absurd that these guys are literally dressed like it's 1942 and in college, but the reaction that it had amongst the black petite bourgeois PMC types that I saw on social media, who were literally like, "Oh my God, this is wonderful! Look at this! Oh, Morehouse!" Because for those who also do not know, that there's a particular way in which historically black college and university culture resonates within the black professional managerial class, particularly the what I would call the big 5 or 7 elite historically black colleges which would be Howard University, Morehouse College, Spelman College, Hampton University, maybe FAM University, Xavier, and some would say Dillard, depending on what day of the week. And what it is that those particular institutions are a feeding ground, usually to elite or sometimes Ivy League white graduate programs, law schools, and professional schools into the black professional and managerial class or the black petite bourgeois, and they have been for a while. And because they are heralded and marketed as the quintessential black experience, they almost have held a kind of sacrosanct position in black communities. What I find particularly fascinating about that is that when you read the origins of these schools, there's 2 very good books that I would suggest. One is called The Education of Blacks in the South by James Anderson, and the other one is called The White Architects of Black Education. What you find is that these institutions were not necessarily created or financed initially to give black people the educational caliber that was equivalent to their white to the white students who were attending college, but to really provide them with a kind of inferior industrial education, or at times even liberal arts educations that were not necessarily of the same caliber of the white schools, until actually black students had to fight to actually improve the caliber of these schools. Now, I am not antagonistic to HBCUs because I think they do serve an important purpose. And the purpose that they serve is that they disproportionately service the educational needs of poor and working class black kids who normally would not be admitted into college. So they do serve a material benefit in terms of being able to provide education for many black kids who otherwise would not be able to get accepted into higher education. But the notion that they are somehow some kind of revolutionary, transformative, or pro black counter hegemonic institutions are quite incorrect, because if you talk to people who teach at them, for example, Jared Ball has a great series he does on HBCUs and how he basically is talking about how what was that show that Bill Cosby did in the 90s that everyone loves? A Different World. It's not like A Different World. HBCUs are very conservative, often very reactionary. Many of their presidents are and have been Republicans. So when I see the fusing of this kind of romancing Jim Crow iconography vis-a-vis Ralph Lauren and the folks who I know who come out of these institutions who are, adherents of like black elite or membership societies, fraternities, and these institutions that are strongly wedded to the black political class. Frankly, these images make me a bit nauseous. And the pinnacle of that nausea for me was an article in the Washington Post that sums up the Ralph Lauren line this way: Ralph Lauren revises his vision of the American dream, inspired by the style of HBCUs. Now, for me, what's fascinating is that the American dream is using the style of HBCUs when the life of most people in America was pretty much, who were black, a nightmare. But yet, for some reason, because most people, particularly of that class, are so desperate for validation and vindication and looking for a means to kind of redeem blackness that they will look to Ralph Lauren, and he's paying attention to the black HBCU aesthetic of the early 20th century and feel like he's giving them some type of reason to celebrate their particular fusion into the American dream. Now, I have no problem with black folk deciding that they want to claim their American identity or being American. But anytime I hear black people in America talking about, oh, we're living the American dream, frankly, it makes me nauseous because the super majority of black people in this country are still living a poor and working class nightmare. And it just illustrates the full delusional capacity of the petite bourgeois PMC element of black America that has always worked with the ruling class to ground most black folk to dust, and how nothing is more important to them than maintaining their status as members of the Death Star that is helping facilitate the evisceration of those that they claim to care about under the charade of racial uplift.
I've got a question, Pascal. You mentioned this nostalgia that especially sort of petit bourgeois, professional class or aspiring professional class, black people have for the segregated black-only world of the Jim Crow era and the stratum of successful business owners, professionals, etc., that it created. And that's kind of what you see in the aesthetic from Ralph Lauren, right? These aren't maids' uniforms. These aren't the clothes that sharecroppers would wear in the fields. They're obviously the black elite of that age.
Correct.
Is that nostalgia or that romanticism a regional phenomenon, more in the South than in the North, or in the East and the West, or is it common across the different communities?
Very good question. I would answer in this sense. It is a class and political ideological phenomenon in that it is common amongst the black petite bourgeois or those who particularly are from old generational black petite bourgeois. In other words, you don't hear that as much from black folk who grew up in poor or working class environments who are first generation college graduates, right? You will hear that from someone, frankly, who comes from 5 or 6 generations of HBCU college graduates or college graduates in general. Because what is true is that America, because of the necessity of creating this charade of collective black underclass identity. What do I mean by that? Basically, in the eyes of most Americans, all black people are poor. All black people are two
Jim
steps away from each other.
Biden had that a gaffe when in the last campaign when he was saying that a lot of these poor kids are just as smart as he was looking to say rich, but he said white instead.
Right, exactly. And what Joe Biden doesn't know is that while his ancestors were somewhere in I don't know, Delaware trying to find potatoes as immigrants, they were black people who were at Ivy League schools in the early 20th century. So one of the particular things that I find kind of noxious about the racism of contemporary urban white ethnics, i.e., you're Irish, you're Italian, about how they view black people, is that while they were being actually led in the back of WASP Anglo-Saxon Protestant houses in America as well, there were actually black people who had capital and some degree of wealth at all. But at the same time, I don't celebrate those individuals because I realize that their positionality as entrepreneurs is a direct consequence of their ability to basically suck the blood out of a captured economic community of the majority of black people who were forced to be working for submenial jobs for whites, but they were able to leverage their class positionality to basically capture the business market. But to answer your direct question, what you will find is that it's not a regional phenomenon. To answer the class ideological part, you'll find it's something about black petit bourgeois educated, usually multi-generationally educated black folk, or ideologically black people who tend to be of the black nationalist ideological bent are very, very hard, even hoteps, if you will, very hard into that way of thinking as well.
When you describe the multi-generational, especially the Harvard, the historically black colleges and universities legacy, to what extent is that nostalgia or that memory reproduced inside the institutions?
Well, it's a very perceptive and good question, because the numbers of black folk who have that pedigree, that multi-generational HBCU pedigree, are very, very, very small. I mean, Jason and I have a good friend who is one of them, which is Torrey Reed. Torrey Reed comes from like sixth generation of college educated black folk. Janice Graham, who we talk about often on on the show. Janice Graham comes from like six or seven generations of educated black people. She's literally like the 28th person in her family who's a member of one of these old line black sororities. So there are black people who are like this. Some people would call them the Afro Saxons or black Brahmins or our kind of people, if you will. But they are a very, very tiny, tiny sliver of the black community. They have their own social, they often go to Martha's Vineyard in Oak Bluffs. They have their own type of secret societies, Jack and Jill. They populate black fraternities and sororities as well. They have organizations like the Girlfriends, the Links. These are all petit bourgeois black membership organizations that are proliferated with a class of black people. And many of these organizations were created intentionally to create a class buffer. For example, Jack and Jill is a black upper middle class children's organization that maintains a kind of cultural atmosphere for black kids of the black professional managerial class or elite. It was started in the early 20th century. And the woman who started Jack and Jill, and I know this because one of my frat brothers in law school was dating the granddaughter of the founder of Jack and Jill. And she was one of those women who came from an elite family, but she had kind of like radical politics. And we were sitting at his house and we were just like watching a sports game and we were talking about these organizations. She said, and I remember this vividly. She said, my grandmother started Jack and Jill. So upper middle class, light skinned black people and their children did not have to play with poor ghetto, dark skinned Negroes from the hood. I was like, okay. That's interesting. I'm sure you don't say that in your history books, but that's interesting nonetheless. And she was very transparent about the class nature of why this organization was started. Now, I have friends that I went to college with, to law school with, who have children who are in Jack and Jill today. What is ironic is that those people, they wouldn't have been able to hang out in Jack and Jill when they were growing up because they are what you would call nouveau riche strivers. They're kids who grew up in working class or poor environments, but for the grace of the civil rights movement, minority set asides, affirmative action, whatever, or their good grades, they got into college, went to elite law schools, and became very successful. And now their kids are in Jack and Jill and these other organizations. But they themselves, when they were growing up, there's no way they would have been affiliated with those organizations. So some of these organizations, for example, black fraternities and sororities, work as a acculturation mechanism for blacks who are working class, who are college educated, after initiation, to become acculturated into the accoutrement of the black elite. So it's kind of like a siphoning system that there's certain ways that you can work your way up and in that you move up into that category, into that class kind of infrastructure and social structure.
And it sounds as though when you say acculturation, it sounds as though it's a vehicle for training people in cultural capital, which is especially important if they didn't have it growing up, right?
Correct. And it's a very important, there's a tangible training as well. When I mean tangible, let me give you an example. When you join these black fraternities and sororities and these organizations, you learn Robert's Rule of Orders, parliamentary procedure, how to function at a convention, how to organize a business meeting. You learn to interface with elders in the black political class and how to dress in a certain way, what kind of aesthetics to maintain, what kind of attire. So it's not just simply acculturation in terms of clothes, food, and what fork to use. There are actual skills that are transferable that you actually pick up being affiliated with these organizations.
To what extent do you think they parallel what happens in white fraternities, secret societies, youth organizations for the Boston Brahmins, the Anglo elite?
I think that they basically are a black version of the same institutions, except that because they are such a smaller percentage of the black community and are used as racial ventriloquists for the black poor and working class, the charade of racial uplift and maintaining the we serve the community is a more integral part of their aesthetic and functionality than it is within the black. No one's expecting a 12th generation Harvard educated WASP who's a member of, say, what's the name of the big house at
Skull and Bones?
Skull and Bones is Yale, but there's another one.
Oh, Porcelainian?
Yeah, Porcelainian, who's a member of Porcelainian, to be doing a racial uplift to white kids who live in, I don't know, Appalachia. That expectation doesn't exist. The kid from Porcelainian hates those white kids, and the white kids from Appalachia hate the guy from Porcelainian. And that's
I know the guys from Porcelainian. They don't ever think about those Appalachian kids.
Right, exactly. And this is the danger, toxic poison of class in Black America. Because of the charade of racial uplift and the we must help the community, these Negroes are always placed as what poor and working class black people should cede their leadership to and believe are helping them improve their condition, when just like the guys at Porcelainian, they would rather ground those Appalachian kids to powder. Very similar to the same as the black elite. But the charade of racial kinship and racial uplift forces the majority of black people to put their condition politically and socially literally in the hands of their class enemies.
The one, so part of, you're right that there's no racial uplift program for the Porcelainian or Skull and Bones. After all, their program is we run the world. And since they were racially exclusive for the vast majority of their history, I'm imagining that if you're trying to mirror them, but with under conditions of segregation, it's like, okay, we can't run the world like Skull and Bones, but we can run the black world. And our justification will be this uplift, talented 10th, we speak for you type of narrative.
Correct. Absolutely correct.
Was there ever any attempts to just turn these, or at least some of these organizations, some of these fraternities, into more of a mass organization?
No, because their premise is based on elitism by design.
The value is the exclusion.
Yes.
So, Pascal.
The threads are dope, though.
I was going to say, Pascal, these are some nice looking clothes. So if we were able to swing you one of these suits, custom fit, you're going to tell us never on screen would you wear one of these.
I'm not wearing no 1935 looking ass suit. I'm sorry, I'm not.
What about a 1975 looking ass suit?
That's even more corny. If I want a suit, I'll wear a modern suit.
But
I like a nice suit, though.
Modern suit for you might be like 1997.
No, they do make portly man nice suits for today.
No, I know size wise, but I'm just saying you haven't worn a suit since 1997.
No, I was wearing suits 10 years ago. I got a suit.
Pascal was going to court. Counselor.
I work in the court system.
He was going to court in his Eddie Murphy boomerang suit. You know, you had a red sport coat every time you went to court. Quit lying.
No, I did not.
Kuba, how are you?
So I'm doing okay. Apparently
Tell us about what's going on with mercenaries in Libya, and does any of what you're going to discuss resemble the plot of Iron Eagle?
Iron Eagle had a plane in it, right?
Yes.
And that's the Iron Eagle mercenaries are more of a GCC thing, because there you have air forces that have been purchased from the United States largely, and you have pilots, but you do have contractors, which are essentially mercenaries for logistical services, doing all of the maintenance, doing the training, the logistics around the Air Force, right? The Saudis, Emiratis, the other GCC countries, they have lots of princes who like the kind of Knights of the Sky feel of being a military pilot, but it's much harder for them to reproduce all of the technical capacity that you need to actually keep the Air Force running. But that's basically all the Iron Eagle I got for you.
But you're talking about something a little more serious, a little more insidious.
Yes, what we've seen in contemporary conflicts, it's taking place in Ukraine right now, but also in Syria, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, Iraq, and of course in Libya, is that from a sort of late 18th through Cold War era of military force being largely capacity that you needed a state to cultivate and develop, to get the manpower, to get the materiel, to be able to wage war in that 20th century, 19th century mass formation. You're seeing that link between states and military power unravel under conditions of globalization, the fact that many of these conflicts are taking place in the wake of state failure and state collapse. And there's been the creation of a very large pool of international talent, if you pardon the expression, of ex-special forces troops, or the elite, but ex-Marines, ex-regular soldiers from across the world now have this large international labor pool, this large network of buyers that are happy to contract for their services to do war fighting in completely different theaters. So in the kind of most conventionally well-known case is Blackwater, which then became Z, I guess, or Chai, and then Academy, and now something else, presumably, which essentially took the surplus of military veterans from Western armed forces, especially Americans, but also other NATO powers, and sometimes countries from the global south, if they had a solid military pedigree, and they would make them available to whichever buyer was able to meet their fees. This was kind of an evolution of the executive outcomes model, which did the same thing with South African veterans, pre-apartheid South African veterans, to handle security operations, including some, civil wars and light genocide, the African continent. And the advantages for states when they contract the services of these mercenaries is largely political. When a mercenary is killed, it's not a big news story. It's not a big news story. There's no flag-draped coffin to go home. There's no grieving mother on the news. There's not going to be a political backlash against losses suffered by the private military. And Further, you have some deniability. If they're involved in atrocities, you have a buffer between the culpability and the political actors. So if you need to keep a war going longer and you are in a position where you're unwilling to absorb the political costs of military losses, these contractors, these companies are an extremely useful vehicle for you to project power. And that's if for the United States, for instance, the Afghanistan war could be extended as long as it did because contractors came to outnumber regular troops 4-1 in Afghanistan. They were absorbing losses, they were doing the work, and the footprint for the war in the American civilian population became lower and lower and lower. This has accelerated with wars in the state failure aftermath of countries like Yemen and Libya, and with the entry of, just like we have global competitors to Apple and Cisco with Samsung and Huawei, the non-American world's response was the Wagner Group, a Russian organization led by an ex-lieutenant colonel from the Russian Special Forces, which recruits highly trained Russian veterans and has made its forces available to buyers in places like Libya and Syria especially. They don't look for a government to necessarily be the purchaser. You could just be a private warlord or a faction in a multi-sided civil war. And if you can raise the money, you don't have to go through the complicated process of recruiting your own people who will fight for a political cause or for a national idea. You don't have to train them. You don't have to build esprit de corps. You don't have to do all of the steps which would demonstrate capacity and commitment to a particular political struggle. Instead, you just write a check. These guys get off the plane and they'll do your killing for you. So it's a means of translating economic power into naked coercion without any of the messy middle steps of social mobilization or training or logistics. They'll handle all of that for you. With the wars in Yemen, what's interesting is that the international military manpower, that labor pool, is absolutely essential to keeping the war going against the Houthis. The GCC countries are generally money rich and labor poor. They have a great deal of fiscal autonomy thanks to their oil exports and thanks to economies that are diversifying rapidly. But in many of the GCC countries, the population is made up largely of third-party nationals. They're on work visas. They're residents. They're not citizens. The number of citizens is small. You have to cherish all of them. And if there's dissatisfaction within that group, within your citizenry, it's a very large problem. So it's extremely attractive for governments like that to just sign a check and purchase military services. And in this way, you end up with not just Latin American, especially Colombian mercenaries. Colombian mercenaries are extremely common and very sought after, and I'll get into why in a minute. But also Nepali Gurkhas, Filipino soldiers, people from all over the world, a lot of the global south, that are paid to do the fighting on behalf of the GCC countries in affiliation with local proxies that are happy to fight the Houthis on their behalf. The Houthis are in the exact opposite position. They are choked off from the rest of the world through a naval blockade, through isolated geography. They're poor, extraordinarily poor, but because their struggle is deeply connected to the population, a very high level of commitment, a very high level of morale, they can mobilize their own people to their fighting. So you have Yemenis fighting Colombians and some Westerners, some Asians, and a small number, some local other Yemenis, but a very small number of GCC personnel, which is nominally the intervening powers, for the future of Yemen. And I'll break there, and then I want to get into what's going on with the Colombians. Anything you want to ask, guys?
Yeah, when you said I want to ask a very very pertinent question because you mentioned the Colombians and mercenaries and soldiers for hire, and I'm sure you realize the nexus of those factors with the assassination of Jovenel Moise in Haiti, in that
Absolutely.
basically it was discovered that many of the mercenary actors on the ground were Latin and South American mercenaries that were hired by a yet disclosed entity to pull the trigger. Uh, what are your thoughts on that? And what are your thoughts on the allegations that the United States not only closed its eye and let it happen, but according to the Intercept, may have been more of the orchestrator of the pulling of the trigger on the Jovenel Moise assassination?
So the reason why Colombian mercenaries are so prevalent in the international violence business is that they, through Plan Colombia, through the School of Americas, through different American initiatives, they receive what could be called NATO compliant or NATO equivalent training. And the ones that go on to an elite track have the same skill set that you'd get from a United States Marine, somebody that would normally be extremely expensive to get. But in Colombia, after demobilization, regular pay for soldiers is poor. Veterans pension is $200 or $300 a month. You can get 10 times that working for whatever shady contractor, whatever shady client wants to pay you for your mercenary work. So there's a very large pool of talent that's been underpriced because of the developmental gap between the American style training they receive and the Colombian style pay they get. And that doesn't really have an outlet for their skill set within Colombia. And this is a big problem everywhere. You train people to be very effective killers. You give them some very specific skills, which make them very, if you pardon the expression, productive at this one task. But then once you're done with them, you can't dispose of them. And not all of them are going to become prison guards or sheriffs or, stunt doubles for Hollywood actors. A lot of them continue the work that they've been trained to do, but for the highest bidder. And the Colombia, as a U.S. ally with a long-standing leftist insurgency, the FARC, which recently ended through peace talks, produces soldiers with a right-wing, pro-capitalist, sort of pro-American, pro-Atlanticist mentality. That also can bleed all the way into the far right. So it's easy to convince them to go after leftist targets or to do the bidding of the powers that be, because that's what they've been prepared for. That's what they've been trained to do. And I would not be surprised. In fact, I would be surprised if it weren't the case that there was at least an American go-between that connected the Colombian mercenaries with any potential Haitian client. I'm not going to name any because nobody needs a lawsuit. But as for whether or not there was orchestration within American officialdom, I think what would be more likely is that maybe at the Port-au-Prince CIA station chief level, or maybe at a regional level, some operator within the American security services, maybe a regional director, maybe even something lower than that, um, green lit the assassination without necessarily getting explicit direction from Washington to do so. One other problem with the kind of special forces model and the infiltration of what could be called entrepreneurial market-based thinking into active service military and people within the security apparatus is that you don't have the discipline and the respect for authority, the hierarchy, the deference to national goals and projects that you did in a more Fordist style of military training, like you had mid-century or World War II. So the operatives that are, especially at the elite level, they're trained to act independently, to make decisions that are ruthless, to get things done. So it's very common for special forces operators, especially, to go out on their own and sort of self-authorize operations that they consider to be advantageous to their mission or just to themselves. And there have been reported discipline problems all across U.S. Special Forces, extrajudicial murder, torture, sometimes killing of comrades within the unit that people might think are going to snitch or report on unlawful activities. And this isn't limited to the American military as well. For instance, the Zetas cartel in Mexico, one of the most ruthless of the drug trafficking cartels, based, I think, in the Northeast. That was an American-trained elite counterterrorism unit that recognized that the income opportunities of becoming their own cartel greatly exceeded whatever they could expect in government service.
And don't they blow up kind of during the time of sorry about that. Don't they blow up during NAFTA?
Oh, the Zetas?
Yeah, Mexican cartels in general, but yeah.
Oh, so the Mexican cartels blow up
after the downfall of the Colombian kind of empire that has a centralized control on the cocaine trade, and once they're decentralized, I guess you would say, that open market really drives down the value in Colombia, but the route through to the States definitely becomes where the cartels gain some strength.
So during the heyday of the Medellin and Cali cartels in Colombia, their ability to control cocaine production gave them the peak position in the narcotics value chain. And that was because the transit was easy. You got the cocaine together in Colombia, and then getting it to Florida by speedboat, by plane, by small, through the Caribbean route was relatively trivial. So you had what could be called poor traffickers, rich producers. When the and part of that is actually just a monopoly play by the Colombian cartels to prevent Peruvian or Ecuadorian or cultivation and production of cocaine elsewhere in Latin America. When those cartels are broken, and part of the response against those cartels is clamping down on the Caribbean route. You break up the monopoly producer, and there's, like you said, decentralized production all over Latin America. But the transshipment becomes the problem, and that becomes the key link in the value chain. When NAFTA opens up Mexican and American trade, it becomes much easier to move cocaine through the Mexican border than it is through the Caribbean. And that's when the Mexican cartels explode in importance. Part of the reason why they get involved in all of these cartel wars is to try to reproduce the monopoly position that the Colombian cartels once enjoyed, but it's too big and diverse an ecosystem for a single cartel to be able to effectively run the market.
And I apologize for throwing you off of your original point. If people really want to know more about cartels, Mexico and Colombia, there's an episode we have of This is Revolution with myself and Derek Varn going much more deeper in depth for a couple hours about this. So I apologize, Kuba.
Oh, no problem. But this actually connects with what I was saying before, that when you have this overproduction of violent professionals, you have that secondary market develop, the market for mercenaries. Send them to Syria, send them to Libya, send them to Yemen, send them to Ukraine. Now, that is very dangerous and bad and lamentable in and of itself. And somebody asked, how is this even legal? And there is a UN effort to try to outlaw the mercenary industry. A number of countries have signed and ratified it, but especially with the reliance of the US on contractors in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the ability to create enough of that majoritarian super consensus to get a binding UN resolution through the General Assembly and the Security Council, you can forget it, right? Like, at this point, the United States would veto it, Russia would veto it, probably the British, maybe even the French. It's just not going to happen, but it would be good for the world. However, that said, consider the alternatives for where those violent professionals might go. Unless you have some kind of demobilization scheme in place, then those special forces guys, their alternatives are become mercenaries. There might be a few jobs doing some kind of script consulting or stunt work in the entertainment industry. They can write books. They can become Republican congressmen if they feel like it. But one of the largest markets for that skill set is organized crime. Another is terrorism. And the influx of largely men, overwhelmingly men, who are comfortable with violence and trained on how to do it very effectively creates grave dangers for the political life of countries. They can become political actors of their own. And for instance, Vadim Volkov, in charting the decay of the Russian state after the end of the Soviet Union and the rise of mafia and oligarchs, identifies Afghanistan war veterans, especially from the elite units, as one of the groups most likely to enter and effectively operate as new next generation mafia in the 90s and through to the 2000s. If you consider that we also have Bitcoin and cryptocurrency that make illegal transactions, that make it very easy to untraceably purchase assassinations, other kinds of violent intimidation.
Did we lose the sound? Deep State got him. Deep state.
Me now?
God.
We hear you now.
Me now.
Sorry,
They
Kuba.
had you for a
Sorry,
second, Kuba.
Kuba. Let me get you off the screen.
Can you hear me now?
Jesus.
Hear you
Sorry.
now. Hear you now. Yes.
I can't hear
Yes,
him.
we can.
Okay.
I can't hear him at all. You can hear him?
What?
Pascal, can you hear me?
How?
Hello,
Now
Pascal.
I can't
can you
hear anybody
me?
else.
What the fuck?
Deep state
So-
is all up in TIR tonight.
Oh,
It's funny, guys. What's happening?
oh my God.
We are okay. They can hear everyone. I can hear you, Kuba. But for some reason, we're having some technical difficulties. Isn't this fun, kids? It seems to me that I'm only one on the screen that everyone hears. And where is Jason? For some reason. But Kuba was giving a nice little monologue.
I have no idea why that happened. My computer totally froze and I couldn't do anything. So whatever Kuba said, it was too much. Kuba, you've said too much.
I
See?
was wondering when it was going to happen.
Everything's working now. Not a coincidence. Like literally, Pascal, I got up to pee and I came back when I heard Kuba shut off and everything stopped working. And it was because your job was like, well, Agent 79.
He talks too much. He must go. Goodbye.
Unplug the cord. Unplug the cord.
Yeah, they're not even Russian. They're just some guy from fucking Wisconsin.
Yeah, like, I don't want to shoot him. The paperwork is too much.
That was I am so sorry everyone for that problem. But when you have the middle management from the Death Star, sometimes the Vader regime likes to clamp down. I think it's the Moff Tarkin that really is the clamper downer of information leaving the Death Star, as they were very, very mad about those plans some time ago. Only the real nerds know what we're talking about.
All right, I'm not sure when it cut out, and I'm not sure if it's actually a good idea.
Yeah, that was weird. That was probably one of the weirdest.
It's so cool when they come at us. So
Yeah, is the name of your Wi-Fi like ZetaNet or something?
we're talking about like Mexican mercenaries.
Yeah, the first thing, we had a rule. I thought we had a rule that while I'm down here, that I don't talk about anything in this country unless I'm talking about how wonderful it is, how happy I am to be here, how safe it is at all times.
It's a beautiful place.
It's beautiful.
Sunshine and smiles.
Did I tell you? So I will say this before I go on my rant. We're going to go a little long. That's fine. We had some problems. I walked out of the house. I always lock my door when I walk out, and I always have my keys in my hand because there's an automatic gate that I have to open. And I walked out of the house without my keys. I locked the door. I locked myself in. The landlord, who would have a copy of the key, is gone. They're out of the state for a while, and there's no one that has a spare key. There's no way to get in. I have a big sliding glass door. It's locked. Everything is locked. And they're doing some work on the unit next to me, and me and my neighbor in the front were trying to open the door, and we're very, very incompetent when it comes to trying to pick locks or anything criminal. I then look at the workers, and my neighbor speaks Spanish, so he asked the workers, hey, this guy asshole just locked himself out of his house. In less than 2 minutes, that man popped my window open and snuck into the fucking living room. Scared the shit out of me how easy my impenetrable security was to breach. But I'm glad you can't find my home on MapQuest, because then I'd be scared.
Just move close enough to a secret military base, and it'll never show up.
Did I tell you that there's a military base down the street from where I live? I'm not even trying to be funny.
Yeah, maybe that's one of the things that you don't talk about.
About to say, don't know why you're talking about that. Ha ha ha.
Well, on Wednesday, in response to a rise in inflation, the Fed has decided to raise interest rates 0.25% and might be signaling to have a few more increases in the coming months. Inflation is already running a near 40-year high at 7.5%. Many feel this move by the Fed is too little too late. Besides feeling it at the pump with astronomical gas prices in places like my home state of California, this rate hike will affect short-term loans, car loan rates, and of course, mortgage rates. This is the first rate increase in the COVID era and the first since 2018. Kuba, Pascal, have you guys read at all about this interest rate hike?
I've read that the Federal Reserve is talking about raising the rates 11 times this year.
Yeah, they've been telegraphing that for over a year now.
My question is that if they do that and they actually taper down quantitative easing, as they promised, does that prove my point to Yanis Varoufakis that his whole techno-feudalism shtick is buckus? Since he said it was based on quantitative easing and Fed policy being the main barometer of what allows techno-feudalism to exist.
Well, one thing that this rate hike should remind us of is the lack of a safety net in the United States that what it provides its citizens. Already during the COVID era, despite the tepid moratorium, we've seen mass evictions, a rise in homelessness. People are working harder and longer and still facing or dealing with homelessness. So while unemployment figures may be up, the economic precarity facing many of the working class and poor creates a persistent vision of a bleak future. Gig economy workers, who make up a large portion of the working class, are quitting due to the rise in fuel prices. While Uber and Lyft and Uber Eats have added a surcharge to try to offset fuel costs, it's not enough. Federal minimum wage is low and hasn't seen an increase in 13 years. Not since the first term of Barack Obama have we seen a rise in the minimum wage, and that was a 70-cent increase over a decade ago. In that time, rents have skyrocketed, forcing many people to move further away into the hinterlands, further from their work. COVID inflation has rocked even the disappearing middle class, and now in a country where public transportation, even in the more metropolitan areas, is at best antiquated, making driving the dominant way many of us get to work. With the current fuel price surge, the cost to fill up your gas tank may equal one full day of work before taxes. What does that mean for us? How will Americans react? A few weeks ago, we had two good friends on to talk about science fiction and its critique of society and mostly capitalism and empire. The 1982 film Blade Runner depicts a dark neoliberal hellhole that its citizens accept as eternal and a given. There is no resistance because you can't resist the inevitable. Blade Runner is no longer the scary future, but it's actually the past. It's now. Susan Sontag wrote in a 1965 essay on Cold War-related science fiction, "We live under continual threat of two equally fearful but seemingly opposed destinies: unremitting banality and inconceivable terror. It is fantasy served out in large rations by the popular arts, which allows most people to cope with these twin specters. For one job that fantasy can do is to lift us out of the unbearably humdrum, and to distract us from terrors, real or anticipated, by an escape into exotic, dangerous situations, which have last-minute happy endings. But another one of these things that fantasy can do is to normalize what is psychologically unbearable, thereby inuring us to it. The fantasy to be discovered in science fiction films does both jobs." Have we normalized this dystopia to the point of inaction, Is the threat of looming stagflation or yet another recession a shoulder shrug moment? Or will it be the perfect opportunity for another possibly worse demagogic figure than Trump with an actual ideology to rise up and lead us deeper down into a fascistic future? What actions can even be done to attempt to mitigate the harm? I don't have the answers, but I'd love to discuss with you guys further in the champagne room. On behalf of the TIR crew, we will see you guys there. And we are out.